Okay, so why don't we get started, everybody? I'm sorry you may have to share some of the handouts, and I apologize for being a little bit short. Didn't know that this was such a popular topic. Amalek, I guess there's a disclaimer at the outset that we know that this coming Shabbos, we're going, not this coming Shabbos, a week from the Shabbos, we're going to be reading a Haftorah and we're going to be reading a maftir that tells us that there's a mitzvah to wipe out the entire nation of Amalek, men, women, and children. There is a popular uh, canard, popular accusation. You know, the Jews are taking a beating with the propagandists these days that are pro-Palestinian. And one of the things that I've seen that they've accused us of is because we call Hamas the Amalek, call them the nation of Amalek. So this one guy is on these talking head shows, and he says, "Well, if you call us Amalek, then that means that you believe you should wipe out every man, woman, and child from Amalek." And so you see, that's genocide. That's the Jews believe in genocide. Right? So what is the correct response to that? Does that mean, oh no, we can't use Amalek anymore? Can't use that moniker anymore, right? Well, I don't think that's the correct response. I think the correct response is that there has never been, since the times of King Saul, a commandment to wipe out the entire nation of Amalek. There are so many conditions that were necessary in order to actually practically fulfill the Torah's commandment of wiping out an entire nation or entire clan of people. And certainly since biblical times, since late biblical times, all of the nations were mivulbal, were mixed with each other and went and displaced by King Sancheriv. So there's literally impossible to know who is Amalek today. It's literally impossible. So when we say the word Amalek to describe the enemies of the Jewish people, we're describing a people who subscribe to an ideology. That's the ideology that we're going to try to pin down, but starting with a halachic discussion first. And so I want us to, so that's really the disclaimer. It's like if you say, oh, that person is Satan, you don't really mean that that person is the angelic being, the Satan, that is described in the book of Job, who tempted God and asked him to bring suffering upon Eo. But rather you mean that that person is satanic in their behavior. Okay, so it's fairly obvious. I'm not sure why it was necessary for me to say that, but you never know who's listening, you never know who's watching. Okay. So let's take a look at our handout, and we all understand that there is a mitzvah to wipe out the nation of Amalek. Timche et zecher Amalek mitachat hashamayim lo tishkach. You have to wipe out every single remnant and memory of the people of Amalek from under the heaven, and you may not forget. That would seem to indicate that we should have nothing to do with Amalek, if indeed it is possible to recognize who Amalek is today. So that sort of leads to the question, which is the topic: can Amalek ever convert? A guy from Amalek comes. He says, "Listen, I've traced my lineage down to Haman, and I know Haman was an Agagi. That's what it says in the Megillah. And King Agag was the king of the Amalekites in the times of King Saul, when we have the one time in recorded history where we were commanded to wipe out every man, woman, and child from Amalek." And he says, "I've traced my lineage back to Haman." By the way, the Gemara says, "Mibnei Haman lamdu Torah b'bnei Brak." So the descendants of Haman studied Torah in Bnei Brak. So no one is advocating that you travel to Bnei Brak and seek out Amalek. That would not be an appropriate thing to do. But the question is, what if this person is a Gentile, is a true Amalekite, and he says, "But I've been studying about Judaism, and I'd like to convert." Did anyone see that film clip of that fellow from Gaza who many years ago converted to Judaism? Do you ever see that film clip? He's a frum guy. I think he changed his name from Yusuf to Yosef. I don't remember exactly, but he's a totally frum person who really has been in the news lately because he's horrified by what his former countrymen have done. The Rambam tells us that we're not going to be able to see this inside. The Rambam doesn't deal with the exact question of whether an Amalekite can convert to Judaism, but he does say as follows. Let's look at Halacha Aleph in the Hilchos Melachim Perek Vav. He says, "Ein osin milchama in im adam ba'olam ad shekorein lo shalom shalom." You may not wage war with any entity, with any national group of people, until you give them an opportunity to make peace and to surrender to your terms. Echad milchemes harushus ve'echad milchemes mitzvah. And it makes no difference whether this is a milchemes rishus or a milchemes mitzvah. Those terms refer to two types of war that are halachically parsed in the sources. A milchemes mitzvah is a mitzvah that is involved in the conquest of the land of Israel. A milchemes rishus is a war that the king, at his discretion, can wage with neighbors in the, to expand the borders, or for whatever other reason he feels it necessary to wage battle with people who are outside of Israel. Shenemar, and how do we know that you have to try to make peace before you attack? Ki tikrav el ir lihilachem aleha v'karata eleha l'shalom. As the Torah says that when you come to a city to wage battle with it, you have to call and say, surrender. We're here to make peace with you. We're not here to kill you. You have an opportunity to surrender. That's not the one, sorry. It's a decoy. Im hishlimu v'kiblu sheva mitzvot shenitztavu b'nei Noach aleihen. Now, if they do surrender, and part of the terms of surrender are that they have to accept the 7 Noachide laws, so then, ein horgin mehem nishama v'harei hein lamas. Then you may not kill any of them, but they become now part of your taxation system. They become under your domination. Shenemar yulacha lamas va'avaducha. They become part of your under the crown of your people, and they become your servants. We're skipping a number of lines, but we go to halacha daled. V'im lo hishlimu, o shehishlimu v'lo kibla sheva mitzvot. But if they surrender and want to make peace, or if but they're not willing to accept the 7 Noachide laws, or if they refuse to surrender, osini mahem milchama v'horgin kol hazicharim hagidolim. So then you wage war with them, and you kill only the adult males. Ubozizin kol mamonam vitapam, and you despoil them of all of their assets. Ve'ein horgin isha v'lo katan, you're not allowed to kill women and children. Shenemar v'hanashim v'hataf, ze taf shel zicharim. As the Torah says, rak hanashim v'hataf, right, you're not allowed to kill. That's written in the Torah. Bameh dvarim amurim b'milchemet harishut shehu im sha'ar ha'umot. But this halacha, that you may only kill the adult males and not women and children, only applies when you're waging war with the other nations. Aval shiva amamin va'amalek shelo hishlimu. But if the 7 Canaanite nations, who are also given an opportunity to surrender and live in peace as long as they accept the 7 Noachide laws, if they refuse to do so, or if Amalek, who may live even outside the borders of Eretz Yisrael, if they refuse to surrender, ein manichin mehem nishama, then you may not leave any of them alive. Shenemar, and this sounds quite harsh, kein ta'aseh l'chol hagoyim ha'ele v'gomer rak me'arei ha'amim lo techayeh kol nishama. And you wipe out entire populations. This is not a law that is extant today. It's not a law that is applicable today. And it's tragic, the tremendous loss of life that is going on. It tugs at the heartstrings of every single Jew today. I don't think that there is any Jew that I have ever encountered that feels that there can be any justification for the spilling of the blood of innocent children because of anything that the Torah says. It's unfortunate that Hamas is killing their own people, and using us as the tools, so to speak. But it's not that there is no satisfaction that we derive out of any kind of fulfillment of this mitzvah. V'chein hu omer ba'amalek timche et zecher Amalek. And similarly, the Torah says you must wipe out the entire memory of Amalek, which means the entire populace. Uminayin she'eno medaber ela be'elu shelo hishlimu. But now we get to the main point that I wanted to get to. When we say that you have to wipe out the 7 Canaanite nations and Amalek entirely, that's only when they don't surrender. But if they surrender and they're willing to accept the Noachide laws, Shenemar lo hayita'ir asher hishlima el b'nei Yisrael bilti hachivi yoshvei givon et hakol lakhu במלחמה, כי מאת השם הייתה לחזק את ליבם לקראת המלחמת ישראל למען החרימם, מכלל ששלחו להם לשלום ולא קיבלו. The Rambam demonstrates the only time that this harsh law applies based on scripture is only when they don't surrender. But if they do surrender, then you have to allow them to live. You cannot kill anybody among their people, and they are allowed to therefore accept the 7 Noachide laws and live together with you in peace. Now, we're going to see a very important responsum from the Avnei Nezer, Rabbi Avraham of Sochatshov, who is the Avnei Nezer, is a very, very important responsum work from the 19th century, goes on the Shulchan Aruch. And we're going to discuss the issue of Amalek converting. But in order to understand what the Avnei Nezer says, we now at least have an understanding of the psak of the Rambam. You only kill the enemy when they don't surrender, including the 7 Canaanite nations and including Amalek, which means that you don't unconditionally wipe out Amalek. If Amalek wants to do tshuva and Amalek wants to make peace with you, there's no mitzvah whatsoever to destroy them. So in order to understand the following, yes.
Honestly, of course you feel safe, but if they're using that as a route, of course they're on right attacking from then how do you know that they will honestly uphold this?
That's a very good question. How do you know? How do you know that it's not a trick? Yeah. Well, I'm not really sure that there was ever a time when the people of Gaza professed this love for Israel and acceptance of the 7 Noachide laws. Yeah, Michelle.
Like for Amalek, because remember they attacked you from behind when you were tired, when you were.
Yes.
Like,
absolutely. Well, okay, so you're touching on a very important issue. The reason for destroying Amalek is totally different from the reason for destroying the 7 Canaanite nations. Why does God want us to destroy the 7 Canaanite nations if they don't surrender and accept the 7 Noachide laws? Because assimilative, avodah zarah, they're going to be a bad influence and they're going to cause the Jews to reject the Torah. Why does the Torah want us to wipe out the nation of Amalek? Because of what they did to us, like Michelle said, because of what they did to us historically, which means the great-great-great-great-grandchild of Amalek could be the sweetest of the sweet. A sweet little Adel young boy, and he's done nothing wrong except having a great-great-great-grandfather who was a Nazi, a maneuvel, and attacked the Jews and did all these types of horrific acts of genocide. And you still have to wipe out Amalek. So I think part of your question is that where does the Rambam get this halacha from? You know, if the necessity to wipe out Amalek has nothing to do with the individual that I'm attacking, but rather because of his ancestry, then how do you know? How do you know that there's this ability to let Amalek rehabilitate themselves? Yeah, Alan.
And Yeshua, actually said Yeshua basically says he's tricked by them. And had he not given the word, he would have destroyed you.
That was the Givonites? Excellent question. The Avnei Nezer is going to deal with that exact question in a moment. Let's take a look at just a few pieces from the Talmud and from Tanakh and from the Midrash, and then we'll start on the Avnei Nezer. So these are third sort of prerequisite texts that you need in order to understand the Avnei Nezer. So the Gemara says that the Gemara in Sota is engaged in a conversation about what kind of stones did they erect on the borders of Eretz Yisrael, where they were writing the entire Torah upon it. But Rabbi Shimon says that when God commanded the Jews to set up these very large stones and write the entire Torah on these stones, al gabe sid kisavuha, v'kasvu lahen lamata. They wrote the entire Torah on stones that were plastered over so that the stylus would have an easy time writing on the plaster. And then at the bottom line, they wrote, Laman asher lo yilamedu etchem la'asot kechol ta'avotam. That the reason why these laws are necessary to post at the entrance to the land of Israel is because we don't want any assimilative forces to infiltrate the land of Israel and to have a negative effect upon the indigenous inhabitants. Ha lamadata, what you see from here is Shem hayu chozrin b'tshuva hayu mekablinotan. So you see from here that even the Canaanites, if they would do tshuva, we would accept them. So you see, this is the basis for the Rambam understanding that the Canaanite nations, at least, have the ability to remain living side by side with the Jewish people in peace and harmony, as long as they want to live peacefully with us and they want to observe the 7 Noahide commandments. Now, if we take a look at the story that we're going to, this is not the story that we're going to be reading in a week from the Shabbos in Parsha Zachor. This is a tragic story about the death of King Saul. This is in Shmuel Bey's Perek Aleph, and it talks about how King Saul died on the battlefield, but died with the help of a young Amalekite convert. That's exactly what the scripture writes. He was an Amalekite convert who helped King Saul when he said, I'm taking my spear. You know, I think, what do the Japanese call that? Carry. Yeah, carry, right? Taking the spear. And so Shaul said, I need some help. Help run the spear through me and help me commit suicide. Okay? So that's what the Amalekite young man does. And in the scene at the beginning of Perek Aleph of Shmuel Bey's, you have this young man coming to King David. Vayomer lo David, Pasuk Gimel. King David says to him, Emizet tavo, Vayomer elav machane Yisrael niplatiti. The young man says to him, I have escaped from the Israelite camp that was under attack. Vayomer elav David mehaya hadavar haged nali. And King David says, tell me what happened on the battlefield. Vayomer asher nas ha'am min hamilchama v'gam harbei nafal min ha'am. He says, we had to retreat. We had to run away from the enemy. They were overpowering us. Many people fell in battle. Vayamutu v'gam Shaul v'Yehonatan b'no metu. Tragedy is that King Saul and his son Yehonatan, David's best friend, fell in battle as well. Vayomer David al Hanar hamagidlo eich yadata ki meit Shaul v'Yehonatan b'no. How do you know that Saul and his son Yehonatan died? Vayomer Hanar hamagidlo nikro nikreti bahar hagilboa v'hinei Shaul nishan al chanito. I was up at Mount Gilboa. Here's King Saul leaning against his spear. V'hinei harechavu baalei aparashim hidviku. He was completely surrounded, knew he was about to be killed by the enemy or arrested and taken and abused. And there he says to me, young man, come over. And he says to me, who are you, young man? And I said to him, Amaleki Anochi. I'm an Amalekite. And so King Saul then said to me, Amodna alai umoteteni. I want you to take the spear and push it through and kill me. Okay? And this is what this young man is relating to King David. So this is what I did. Went ahead and I killed King Saul at his request. Mercy killing. Because I knew that there was no way that he was going to survive. The enemy was about to take him and kill him, right? They were probably going to desecrate his body. And so I was really doing him a toiva. And here I have his crown and I have his special royal ring. And I'm giving it to you now, King David. I just imagine this young man. He thinks he's done the biggest mitzvah, right? He's done a mercy killing of King Saul. What a wonderful thing. He's a virtuous young man. He's got every good intention. But what is the end of the story? Vayachazek David bivgadav yikraim. So King David, of course, hears this horrible news and he tears his clothing and everyone's crying. And then if you look at verse 13, it says, Vayomer David al Hanar hamagilo emizeat vayomer ben ish ger Amalekite anoch. David says, who are you? The young man says, I am a convert from the Amalekites. Vayomer elav David eich lo yareit lishlach yadcha l'shachet et Mashiach Hashem. Then King David criticizes him. He says, how did you have the audacity to raise your hand and harm the anointed of God? Vayikra David la'achad me'hane'arim vayomer gash pegabo vayakehu vayamot. King David calls over one of his young soldiers. See that young Amalekite? Take care of him. Take care of him. I don't know. And so the young man killed this Amalekite youth. Vayomer elav David damecha al roshecha ki ficha ana b'chalemor anochi motati et Mashiach Hashem. David says to this man as he's dying, you caused your own death because you confessed by your own mouth that you killed the anointed of God and you had no right to do that. End of scene. Okay? Very, very difficult passage to really understand what's going on. But that's what we need to from the story in Tanakh in order to understand the next passage that we're going to learn from the Avnei Nezer. One more thing that we need to see before we get to the Avnei Nezer is a medrash from the Mechilta. And the medrash from the Mechilta is going on the words that we're going to read on Purim. Ki yad al keis ka milchama l'Hashem ba'amalek midor dor. That there is an eternal war from generation to generation, and this is God's oath that he swears by his throne that this war will be an incessant battle with Amalek, a perennial battle. So there's a number of different opinions exactly how to interpret this pasuk midrashically. So I'm going to skip, for time's sake, to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, it's on the third line. Nishba hamakom b'kisei hakavod shalo. God swears by his glorious throne. She'im yavo echad mikol umot olam lihitgayer sheyikabluhu. Any person from any other nation who wants to convert to Judaism, we accept him. V'la amalek uleveito lo yikabluhu. But we never accept a convert from the Amalekites. Shenemar vayomer David al Hanar hamagidlo emizeata vayomer ben ish ger Amaleki anochi. So, and the proof is from the story that we just read from Sefer Shmuel. Now, David must have concluded that this young man was not was not a convert, was not a legitimate convert, even though he told King David, "I'm a convert from the Amalekites." Nizkar David ba'ota sha'a ma shenemar leMoshe Rabbeinu. That David at that moment remembered what he had heard Torah Sheba'al Peh from all the way going back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Im yavo echad mikol ha'omot sheba'olam lihitgayer sheyikabluhu umibeito shel Amalek shelo yikabluhu. That he remembered that we accept any non-Jew who wants to convert, but we will not accept an Amalekite. Iyad vayomer elav David damcha al roshcha ki ficha anavach lekach ne'emar midor dor. That is the perennial nature of the war with Amalek. That no matter what the generational changes that take place, we will never accept anyone from Amalek. Now, does anyone see anything troublesome between what the Midrash, the Mechilta, has now taught us, based on the story of King David, and what the Rambam has taught us about the Amalekites. Anyone see an inconsistency? You mean the Rambam? What did we see? What did we see from the Rambam? The Gemara was not talking about Amalek. The Gemara was talking about the 7 Canaanite nations. But we need to store that piece of Gemara in our data banks. We do accept converts from the Canaanite nations, but the Mechilta says that we do not accept converts from the Amalekites. The Rambam, however, seems to treat the Canaanites and the Amalekites exactly the same, and says that as long as they accept the 7 Noachide laws and they surrender, they can live in peace with you. Is there okay? So what do we see from here? Well, that's the question. What does it mean? Is it only conversion that we don't accept? If that's the case, then why is King David killing this young man? Perhaps he's deserving of the death penalty. And is it relevant then that whether or not he was Jewish? Let's take a look at the Avnei Nezer now, which is sort of forms the foundation of so much Torah that comes after the Avnei Nezer about this very discussion. So he first starts off quoting the Rambam, Da'asa Rambam, this is source number 6. The Zayin umos va'amolek im ishlimu mikablim otam. Where he quotes the Rambam as saying that if the Canaanite nations and the Amalekites, if they surrender, we accept them. Hainu shemikablim zayin mitzvot umasim v'shibud, which means they have to accept the 7 Noachide laws of behavior. They have to live ethical and moral lives, and they have to also realize that they become indentured servants to the Jewish nation. So to Alan's question, why did the Gibeonites in the book of Joshua have to masquerade? Why did they do that? As masquerade as being foreigners, not being indigenous people to the land of Canaan. If even Canaanites, if they surrender, you accept them. The answer is that they wanted even more than just to live in peace and be indentured servants. They wanted to make a covenant with the Jews that they could coexist as equals. That seems to be what the Avnei Nezer is answering. So, Alan, your question is answered, okay? So far? Okay, let's go on. So I have a problem. The Afim b'zayin umot mo'il hashlama b'kol makom ba'amalek minayin. I could understand, we know the Gemara that we saw together, that we allow the 7 Canaanite nations to surrender, and we based it on a pasuk that the Gemara had presented. But where do you see that an Amalekite is allowed to surrender? Shaharei bisot laman asher lo yilamedu etchem la'asot halamadeta shim hayu chozrin b'tshuva hayu mekablim otam. We see that the whole reason for not accepting the Canaanites and allowing them to live with us is that we shouldn't assimilate to their values of idolatry, which by inference means that if they're willing to reject their way of life and live like us, we do accept them. And we're not going to go through all of the Rashi here. We're going to skip to the next line. But Mimela ba'amalek deleka krami nolan. But for the Amalekites, there is no such verse that says that the reason why we don't accept them is because they're going to be a bad influence. The reason why we have to kill Amalek is because the Torah says, remember what they did. Ve'ein lomar di'alfinan Amalek mishivas umos, and don't say that you can infer one from the other. Deleta deshaini shiva umot detam shemachriminotam kidei shelo yilamedu la'asot. Aval Amalek she'eno be'eretz Yisrael v'tam mechiato mishum vayavo Amalek minalan demahani hashlama u'tshuva. This is what Michelle was asking, right? What the Avnei Nezer is saying, just because we know that you can make peace with the 7 Canaanites as long as they don't act as a bad influence and cause you to assimilate, but that's not the reason for the destruction of Amalek. Even if they live outside of Eretz Yisrael and they're not going to influence and live with us in society, you still have to kill them. So where do you see that there's this allowance that as long as they do tshuva and they accept Shiva mitzvos, that you don't have to kill them? The reason we kill them is because of this historical event that might have happened thousands of years ago. So he says in Os Gimel, V'hanira li bazeh Deshanya zayin umot shechotim ba'atzmam va'osim kol hatoivot unachayvo mita. That he says, with the 7 Canaanite nations, they themselves are the ones who are committing acts of idolatry, which makes them guilty. V'hava amina shelo yoel teshuva. And therefore, the reason why I need a special pasuk to tell me that they have the opportunity to rehabilitate themselves and do tshuva, and we won't kill them, is because kemo kol chayvim mitot beitin she'niftarim chiyuvam al yedei tshuva. Because otherwise, just because an idolater says, I have seen the light and I'm doing tshuva, that doesn't mean that they're exempt from the death penalty. If a person is convicted in a Jewish court and they're convicted of a death penalty, we don't free them from Beis Din and free them from the death penalty because they say, I have seen the light and I wish to repent to Hashem. That's wonderful, you wish to do tshuva. When you get up to Shemayim, and after we bury you, you'll go up to the higher level, you'll go to Gan Eden. We're very happy for you. But once you've committed the crime, you get the punishment. So why would I think intuitively or logically that just because a Canaanite is willing to reject his past, that we don't kill them because they've done tshuva? Why shouldn't we say no? Your whole life was idolatry. You're chayiv misa. You have to be put to death because a Gentile who violates the Noachide law of idolatry gets the death penalty. So where would I know that we accept him? So therefore, you need a special pasuk for the 7 Canaanite nations to teach you that we do accept them. Avol zera Amalek she'enoshim ba'avon avotam v'lichora haktiv lo yumtu avot al banim uvanim lo yumtu al avot. He says, but why do we kill the Amalekites? It's because of what their parents did, or their grandparents, or their great-grandparents did when we were leaving Egypt. Don't we have a principle in Judaism that children should not die for the sins of the fathers, and fathers should not die for the sins of the children? You hear what Avnei Nezer is asking? Like, just because I happen to be born to an Amalekite family, my last name is Amalek, okay? So just because I was born as an Amalek, I should have to die. I didn't do anything. Where's the fairness in that? Here's where we get philosophical. He says the reason why God commands us to wipe out an entire nation of Amalekites is because God knows that within the national fabric, the national texture of an entire nation of people is a built-in tremendous hatred that is indelibly built within the people. And you see that's the case because Haman comes generations later and is descended from the original Amalek and via Agag. Why he, out of all of the people in Persia, out of all of Achashverosh's advisors, did he get it in his head that he doesn't like Jews? Like, where does this come from? Where did his anti-Semitism stem from? It must be that there was something in his blood, something in his DNA that he inherited in his family that made him not like Jews. And we know the principle, while it's true that children do not die for the sins of the fathers, but when the children adhere to the same evil of their fathers, they do die for the sins of the fathers. Aval. But that's only when we see them repeating the same evils of their parents. And that's the reason why God says we have to work under the assumption that Amalek is always going to be Amalek. If they're descended from Amalek, they're always going to have that built-in hatred for the Jewish people. But if you happen to encounter a group of Amalekites or an individual Amalekite who says, no, I don't want to be like my people. I'm son of Hamas, right? That guy, son of Hamas, I don't remember his name. He says, I hate what my people stand for. I completely reject everything that I come from. And I don't want to be like my nationality. Then you can't, it's not fair to punish a child for the sins of his parents. Yes, Elon. That's divine. That's divine. But to expect a beis din to exact punishment, to proactively do something that is harmful to a human being because of something that a parent did, we don't find that. We don't find that in halacha, right? That's the argument that the Avnei Nezer is making. And it's so therefore, the Avnei Nezer's argument is, granted, you need a pasuk to tell me that if the Canaanite wants to convert, you accept him, because otherwise I would have thought that you should kill him even when he wants to do tshuva, based on the fact that he's spent his whole life worshiping idols and he has to be killed for that. The chiddush is that you don't kill him because he's ready to make peace and he wants to live in the Holy Land together with the Jews, so you let him live. But in Amalekite, it makes absolutely no sense, even without a pasuk, to suggest that if you find a righteous Amalekite who wants to abide by the 7 Noahide laws and wants to be part of the Jewish people, it makes no sense that you would in any way penalize him or punish him. So, if that's the case, let's go on to Ot Daled and Ot He. Uvamesha katavti, based on what I've just written, yesh liyashev ma dekasha al harambam mimechilta sof parshas b'shalach. Now, hopefully, we can reconcile the Rambam's halacha with what we learned in the Mechilta. That the Mechilta says we do not, categorically, we do not accept converts from the Amalekite people. Sheba hamivaser mimitat Shaul ve'omar ger Amaleki anochi. He just quotes very briefly the Medrash, which we saw inside, where the convert said, I'm an Amalekite convert. Va'ota shah nizkar leDavid mashenemer leMoshe Rabbeinu im yavo mikol ha'umos sheba'olam v'hiskayer shekibluhu mibeisa and mibeisa Amalek shel yikabluhu. He just quotes the Mechilta. Shenishba hakadosh baruch hu b'kiso she'ein mekablim gerim mizera Amalek v'harago adkan. And that's why that was King David's rationale for killing this young lad. Hine sha'af gerim gemurim ein mekablim mizera Amalek. Kol shekain kabbalah zayin mitzvahs bilvad. So if we're not even going to accept a full-blown convert from Amalek, then why is it okay to accept a guy who completely converts to Judaism? He accepts upon himself taryag mitzvot, and we still say, no, we reject you. That's what the Mechilta says. Then surely we should reject an Amalekite who's not willing to convert and is only accepting the 7 Noahide laws. You hear the kasha? This is the direct steer, what we say is the direct contradiction between the Rambam and the Mechilta. It's a Shvera Rambam. Okay, everyone with me so far? So, okay. And this is where we get to the final paragraph. Ach lefi ha'amur yesh li yashev al pi ma shekatav betana devei Eliyahu perek chaf daled. The answer is based, again, beautiful philosophy now. Let's look at another medrash. This medrash is non-halachic, but it teaches us a very important lesson about the nature of Amalek. And I want to just preface what I'm about to say to tell you that it's quite unusual to find a Talmudic responsum like this, which it constantly is going in and out of halacha and machshava back and forth. You normally don't mix halacha and machshava, but sometimes the machshava, the philosophy, or the theological or philosophical underpinning of an idea really helps us formulate better the halacha. And this is one of those examples because, after all, Amalek is such a difficult concept to get our heads around. Let's take a look at what it says in Tana Devei Eliyahu. Shetziva Eliphaz la'Amalek beno. The Medrash tells us that Eliphaz, who was Eliphaz? Anybody? Esav's son. Esav's firstborn son was Eliphaz. Amalek was Eliphaz's son. Okay? So Amalek is the grandson of Esav. Okay? But Esav had many, many descendants. Okay? So Eliphaz told his son Amalek. Now, Eliphaz is also quite interesting because we know that according to the Medrash, Esav told his son Eliphaz that when he encounters Yaakov, he should kill him. So the Medrash tells us, I think Rashi, I don't remember where Rashi brings this down, but the Medrash tells us that when Eliphaz encountered his uncle Yaakov, he was so tormented, he was so conflicted because he didn't want to be a murderer, he didn't want to kill his uncle, but his father told him, you got to kill your uncle. So Eliphaz shared with Yaakov, what should I do? So Yaakov said to him, take all my possessions, take everything I own, my clothes, my jewelry, my money, and an ani is nechshav kemes. A poor man is like a dead man. One of the things that is compared to death if you're absolutely impoverished. And you'll have fulfilled your father's edict that you killed me, you made me into a dead man. So you see that Eliphaz has this sympathy for Yaakov and for the Jewish people. So there's another medrash related to this that Eliphaz told his son Amalek, Sheyeda she'olam haba eno mitukan el Israel. Because I want you to know that the Jews have this amazing place where they're going in the afterlife called Olam Haba. Lech v'sayeya otam b'chafirot be'erot uchedome v'tizkeh imahem. And Eliphaz tells his son Amalek, go, my son, join up with the Jewish people, help them dig their wells and their pits and in their infrastructure, and whatever happens to the Jews, you will have the same reward as well. Go, my son, become part of the Jewish people as much as you possibly can. Keven sheshama rishumo shel davar na'aseh sonei v'rodef liYisrael. Ad kan. So listen to the end of the Medrash. Amalek hears his father's instructions, but instead of following his father's instructions, he becomes the biggest enemy of the Jews. He becomes the biggest anti-Semite. Because there's something within him that can't handle the fact that the Jews are destined for the world to come, a special place that no one else in the world has the opportunity to go to. So it drives him nuts, and he becomes the biggest enemy of the Jewish people. And that, according to the Medrash, is the genesis of the hatred of Amalek for the Jewish people. Hinei shezehu shoresh chet Amalek. This, therefore, is the root of the hatred of Amalek. She'eino rotzeh b'shum ofan lihiyot nichna leYisrael. Amalek refuses to be subservient to Israel. Those words are very, very important words. He refuses to be subservient to Israel. The Alkain af shemit gayer, and now, says the Avnei Nezer, I can explain that there's no conflict between the Rambam's law, that we accept an Amalekite who accepts the 7 Noachide laws, versus the Mechilta who says we don't accept converts from Amalek. He says, therefore, af shemit gayer ein ze od hochacha sherotzeh b'hachna'a. The only way that we know that an Amalekite has severed himself from his past, like Dan's question, how do we know he's genuine, is if he's willing to submit himself and lower himself to the authority and to be subservient to the Jewish people. When a non-Jew converts to Judaism, they're not becoming subservient to the Jewish people. They're becoming one of the Jewish people. When you convert, you get called up for an aliyah. They'll even call you up for shishi if you're lucky, right? You have all the rights and privileges of any other Jew. If That's the problem. Is the reason why we can't accept them as converts, because the moment when he sees that something that a natural-born Jew is acquiring, he's not getting, it'll drive him crazy, and he'll go on a rampage. And therefore, if he converts to Judaism, we have no evidence that he's rehabilitated and that he has rejected his ancestry. But when Ulamata v'lo yarimu rosh b'Yisrael v'gam shi'abud. But when an Amalekite surrenders to the Jews in a time of war, and he says, I am hereby your vassal, I am hereby your indentured servant, I accept the 7 Noahide laws, and I am not worthy, and I am now just a ward of the state, and he therefore submits himself, makes himself subservient to the Jews. That kind of Amalekite is someone that we do accept, and we don't say that he's just like any other Amalekite. This is a fellow who has really rejected his past, like the son of Hamas. Okay? So this is the Avnei Nezer's reconciliation, that there's a difference between conversion, where you become just like every other Jew, versus becoming nichna, becoming subservient as a vassal of the state. That is something that shows only when you become subservient have you demonstrated that you've broken from your Amalekite past, which cannot tolerate being subservient to a Jew for anything. And that's the reason why we don't accept converts, like the Mechilta says, but we do accept an Amalekite who wishes to only accept the 7 Noahide laws and become indentured to the Jewish people. Okay? So it's a philosophical answer. It's based on the psychology, the analysis of the psychology of Amalek, but it chaps an afkamin and halacha. In other words, this really demonstrates that there's a halachic discussion to be had here, which is based on a psychological analysis. I don't want to keep you here for the rest of the night, but so I'm going to skip over some of the other answers that the poskim give, including Rav Sternbach and the Chazon Ish and other people as well. And I just want to finish off with a commentary from Rav Hirsch, which I also feel is very, very telling. But the one thing that we've seen so far, and perhaps there is a way to apply this to our modern day realization of what anti-Semitism is and why anti-Semitism constantly mutates from generation to generation. There is always going to be someone to rise up against us. Sometimes it'll be the Nazis, and sometimes it'll be the Palestinians under Hamas, and in another generation, it'll be some other enemy. But there is this absolute inability for a true Amalekite, someone who has this disposition, that he cannot tolerate that anyone should in any way be more special, should harbor or possess a quality that they don't have. And the closer the neighbor you are to that special quality person, the more intolerable that closeness becomes. And therefore, instead of raising yourself up, you want to destroy that reminder of your own inadequacy, of your own inability to raise yourself up to that level. That's the quality of Amalek that the Avnei Nezer has taught us, and it really fits in well with this whole discussion between the Rambam and the Mechilta. But take a look at Rav Hirsch, because I think Rav Hirsch didn't know from Palestinians, he didn't know from Hamas, but he did know from Germans, right? He's writing in the 19th century in Germany. Let's take a look what he says, how he describes Amalek. He, referring to Amalek alone, this is the last page, was the heir of that spirit which chose the sword as his lot, who sought to realize the seeking renown in laurels of blood, and the naselanu shame with which old Nimrod started the history of the world to the destruction of the happiness of nations and men. In other words, Rav Hirsch says that there are two ways that you gain fame. You gain notoriety and popularity in the world. You can either do so by doing something great, or in the ancient world, you became famous and popular by shedding more blood than anybody else. That was the way of Nimrod, okay? This seeking renown by the force of arms is the first and last enemy of the happiness of mankind and of the kingdom of God on earth. The policy of the pharaohs, using force ruthlessly to further their own interests, certainly has interest in keeping up slavery, but it can even be a friend of freedom when freedom serves its interest. But Amalek's renown-seeking sword knows no rest so long as one single pulse beats in freedom and pays no homage to it, so long as any modest, quiet happiness exists, which does not tremble before its might. So the force of Amalek is there to make us all frightened, to intimidate, and to make us all be to cower in submission. Similar forces, armed to the teeth like himself, Amalek does not hate. Listen to that very profound statement. Amalek doesn't hate another powerful army or a powerful nation because they respect powerful, strong military people who are willing to shed blood like themselves, but rather sees in such measures a sign of recognition and fear of his sword. He wages war against them, of course, but honors opponents who acknowledge him and have similar principles to his own. But in Israel, he sees an object of mortal hate and complete disdain, where one dares to think the sword is dispensable, where one dares to trust in spiritual moral powers, powers of which the sword has no idea and which are beyond its reach. And the representative of the idea of the greatness which man can attain by peace, Amalek sees the utter scorn of all his principles, seen in it his one real enemy, and senses somehow his own ultimate collapse. Therefore, when Amalek sees the Jewish people, Vayavo Amalek vayilachem im Yisrael, Amalek came and made war on Israel in Rephidim. Perhaps if Israel's faint-heartedness had not caused Rephidim to be transferred from a passing station to a camping ground, Israel would long ago have already been led on to Chorev, and Amalek would not have caught them in Rephidim. But as it was, Israel had to endure this fresh, anxious, and worrying experience. So perhaps if Israel would have had more confidence in themselves and in their way of life of lovers of peace, they would not have had to fight Amalek. But that is the story. The story of Amalek is the psychology of Amalek is a nation who cannot bear to see any specialness in the other that is just next door to them. And Amalek also cannot bear to see the values of success through peace instead of success through the shedding of blood and intimidation and instilling fear within others. I think those are two values that we can very much relate to in the war that we're seeing today. And again, I close with what I started with. No one is suggesting that the strict law of Amalek to wipe out men, women, and children would in any way be applicable today, because we're not talking about the formal entity of Amalek, the technical entity of Amalek, as it is described in the book of Shmuel, but rather the value of Amalek still exists very much today. The key for the Jewish people to destroy Amalek is to have confidence in who we are, the peace-loving nation of the Jewish people who seek to rise to greatness not because of shedding blood and instilling fear within others, but rather by creating an example of goodness and peacefulness in the hearts of other people. Let's also remember, anytime we cannot bear someone else's great light when they are too close to us, because they make our dimmer light less distinguished, and we too are imitating traits of Amalek. Be careful not to become our enemy. All right? So it's both on a national level and also on a personal level as well. Questions, comments? Yes, Mark.
When we talked about life for Jews in the ages, often it's said how much relatively was better under the Arab countries versus under the Christians. But then they say that the Jews were second-class citizens or dhimmis under the Islamic countries. But when we say, when we would let the 7 nations or whoever live in Israel, isn't the same thing? They're at our pleasure and they have to follow our rules and they can't own land. So aren't they our dhimmis at the same time?
Yes, there is that Zimma principle also, but they are also free to convert the Canaanite nations. They don't, if they choose to convert, they become one of us.
Also.
That's right. That's right. So there is something ancient about this. You find that it no longer works in modern society. Let me just make one very brief comment which needs to be expanded much further. Many of the biblical laws that seem to fit in the ancient world no longer fit in the modern world. We no longer have slavery. and yet the Torah allows for slavery. Does that mean that we should aspire towards Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, restore our days of old, and let us once again, God, have slaves, own slaves? That's not that's not the message that we're trying to project. Was there a time in world history when there were two different classes of people living side by side in the same society? Absolutely. Doesn't work anymore today. And that's not to say that the Torah is wrong, but it's to say that the Torah applies. Some of the mitzvahs of the Torah are more resonant with certain eras of world history than other mitzvahs. Okay? Much longer conversation. Yes, yes.
As propaganda, sheker milvul vows, twisted lies.
Yeah, what we spoke about on Shabbos, yeah. Yeah, that's what we spoke about Amalek on Shabbos, and about how the shekel represents how the Jewish people reject that sheker. We change the sheker into the shekel, the resh into the lamed. Yeah, yeah. Yes, Susan.
Time they looked at the living thing, or reading point, I kind of, those off field, but I find myself a little bit interested in this Amalekite. How was it that he's between Amalek and Esau and kind of does not have that genetic?
I can only imagine how ashamed his family was of him. Yeah. 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 Listen, some people don't come from very good families and they become good people. It's possible, you know. Esav had many redeeming qualities, you know. He did. Okay, Alan, last one, and then we'll cut.
So there are functions. Five descended from the same group that Midler descended from. One, there's actually, and then the other.
Bilam says Reshit Goyim Amalek, like it's a separate nation unto itself. Yeah. Okay. There could have been two people named Amalek. Yeah. Could be. Interesting point. Yeah, Michelle, last one.
Touches on that David's not happy that he killed Shaul, and so maybe when he adds, well, by the way, I'm a convert to Judaism, might help his cause, and I just lied about it.
Ah,
I
interesting.
read that one.
Okay. Right. Everyone should, I will, Mirz Hashem, I'm going to Eretz Yisrael this Thursday. I look forward to seeing you a week from Thursday when I'll be back, and then we'll celebrate Purim together, God willing, and hopefully by then Amalek will be completely destroyed.